Hey, everybody, I'm Jody Vance,
And I'm George-Affleck.
and it's time for
The heat is on. The heat is on. Unspun.
The Heat
You and
Be
I,
On.
we're taking a bit of heat this week, Jody, I think.
Do you want to talk to me? Because I am clearly an irrational woman.
Oh, and I am I have a hidden agenda or an agenda. And I'm like,
You
what? I have no
definitely have
hidden.
a hidden agenda. Hey, listen, actually, before we dive into this, and you don't know
Mm-hmm.
this is coming, but sincerely, last week on this show, I was so frustrated, pissed off, and I think triggered by the Bell layoffs that I got really antsy with you. And I was pushing back. And you know what? We were agreeing with one another, but I was just so upset. I should have taken a minute and I didn't. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's the problem.
I
That's
know, but
part of the
still, it's
fun. But
healthy
yeah,
to
it was an
say, oops,
intense.
I was wrong. Like anybody want to do that, feel free to do it. It feels quite freeing.
I
Sorry,
appreciate
George.
that. I appreciate that. I think it is an emotional thing, especially if you've worked in that industry, and I have, and you have, especially specifically radio. We
Yeah, it was
both work in
sad.
radio. We both work in radio,
We both work in radio.
and we already, we certainly feel the pain. You know,
We
there's
do.
not a lot of
But
money
I
to pay
mean,
for
and
people
you were
like us
making the
anymore.
point about you were drawing a comparison to
Yeah.
small town local newspapers, and I was just so viscerally upset about the radio. The good news is all those stations have been purchased by Vista. There will be local. I hope that some local papers are picked up because the importance of local is growing by the day. And to that point, back to our original, the heat is on Park Board. You and I are championing what is becoming, it's almost like a gaslighting thing. It's like on
Yeah.
social media, if you're not following along on Twitter, it's really interesting to watch George and I be tagged into things. Like people are riding our reach and they're bringing us in. We're not going actively in search of stuff. Like I've
Well,
had to
I did a
mute.
little bit of poking. I did a little bit of poking at John Cooper and the gang there on this is all, I kind of got the ball rolling a little bit.
Yeah, you do. You're a bit of an instigator, aren't you?
Well, but the
You're
thing is
gonna
that
get
you and
the
I are the
extra two
only
minutes.
ones. I
We
feel
are.
like you and I are the only ones sort of saying the park board's broken, besides the party in power in Vancouver. And we have no connections to ABC. I have no connections. I have their friends. I have some friends that are on council, but I've never been involved in that party. I have no relationship with them. I've never been given any money on that. I have nothing to do with those guys. In fact, if anything, you might argue I'm no help to them. But on this front, you and I have said this for 5 years. We've been
Yeah,
talking about the park board and
yeah.
have said our opinions on the park board. So what we're saying is nothing is new.
Nothing's
And our
new.
argument is that it's broken and it's had its time, and and the solution is being provided by ABC Vancouver. It seems like a logical solution. I think the premier will go along with it. Maybe not, but this movement has started. If you're not familiar, in Vancouver has its own park board, its own elected park board, a layer of government that we have in Vancouver that nobody else has. And I've talked about this. I think the premier will say this is elitist. Why does Vancouver have a special thing? Which will play well into his messaging. So we've been talking about this week because there was a big meeting, and I kind of started by saying there's like 100 people there, and I said, oh great, so 635,000 people didn't show up of Vancouverites. I mean, it's kind of, but is it a movement, or is it just the same 100 people that used to come to council and these things? That's the ultimate question politicians have to decide, not you and I. However, we have our opinions on this issue, and we always have.
Totally. And I think that you and I, if there's an agenda, it's to have nice parks that serve the people that have commonsensical rules around them. I
Yeah.
mean, this is not hard. And you know what? If the park board had been achieving that, and that is not to say that amazing things have not been done by park board commissioners in years gone by, and they keep lobbing the things that have been done. I'm like, congratulations. Would those things also perhaps have been done without an elected park board? Because they do happen in other jurisdictions, like right next door, that don't, like everywhere else. But okay, so brava for your past history, brava. But and
Hmm.
they are also saying, oh, and then there are some bad commissioners that have been voted out, ones with agendas and blah blah blah. And I've already done that here. If you want to know about my opinion on historically speaking, some park board commissioners watch early unspuns because I'm not going through it again. But what I will say, the ones that are coming for us now, and they're coming for us, George, they're coming for you and I, who used to be their teammates in their minds. They'd be like, yeah, way to bring it up, way to keep it on the front burner, way to go. Like, and now they're pissed because we're being anti-democratic. And I want to speak specifically to this,
Okay.
this thing that you want to destroy the democratic process of the park board. This just in, okay? We vote in our councillors on the same ballot that we vote in the park board. It's the same ballot that votes in the mayor. It's the same ballot that we decide on big expenditures. It's the same ballot. To try and push I don't even know, an overblown headline that we're somehow trying to rip up the ballot in the process is just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's a talking point. It is, and it's not a good talking point. It proves that you don't have a leg to stand on when you're calling it anti-democratic, to say that 135-year-old thing that's costing all of us taxpayers way more than it should to get nothing done. Like, our parks are not great. And there was one woman, bless her, not going to name her, but there's one woman says, my park's great. I'm like, good for you that your park is great. But the overall, George, our parks have absolutely degraded over the last decade, maybe longer. And John Cooper, we mentioned him off the top, good friend of yours. He has been a friend of mine. I'm finding him to be a little like, I'm disappointed. You keep pulling me in on stuff here, John. Like, he had to go up against it to save the conservatory. He had to fight tooth and nail against the park board, the establishment. Yeah. Like, that's a part of this whole thing that isn't part of the conversation when it's, you're being anti-democratic and you have an agenda and you're an irrational woman. Call me an irrational woman again, please. It really makes you look dumb.
I think, you said history, and I think that's one of their biggest arguments. And isn't it, what's that cliche or that saying, you're supposed to learn from, I don't know what it is, like, history, don't let it, in order for it to
if you don't
itself,
learn from history, you're destined to repeat it. And we can get into that.
We'll get into that later too, about some other stuff. But so with that in mind, I think we have enough history now. We have a long history, and then we have about 20 years, which represents 20 less more than 20% of the history of the park board, about 30% of the history of park board, where it has been dysfunctional and unable to manage itself. Parks have declined in significance. Pools aren't being built. Yes, there's some community centers finally coming online. The yada yada yada
but the
yada.
Community center isn't a park board thing.
Well, there's some that are and some that aren't. So it's
right.
Yeah, there's
but
yeah.
So
anyways,
but
that,
wait a minute. I just want, to your point though, some community centers are and some community centers aren't. So when you're looking at your community center and saying mine's fine, look into who's running it. And if it doesn't take a park board to run it, isn't that a check mark? Isn't that one layer fewer
group,
level of bureaucracy? I'd like to remove some of the bureaucracy. We don't need it. I mean, and in fact, yes, I want all of those park people in City Hall making decisions for the park.
And to that point, those park boards that have the independent sort of, counts, organizations that are managing the park, those community centers, and they do a good job. There's no reason why the city might not say, let's continue that. In fact, let's expand that. That's a good model. That's democracy. Those people are brought in through, AGMs and all those things. So democracy.
They're not just rounding up their friends at the pub. It's not how it's working. It's not. And not the friends at the pub aren't great. I love my friends at the pub. Before we get into like deep conversations, I wanted to say one thing about the mayor of Richmond, Malcolm Brody, who you and I both have interviewed him many times. And he is quite a character. He is a long time serving public servant, deserves the respect based on that, whether you agree with his politics or you don't agree with his politics. Watching him this past week, absolutely zero tolerance with people who were yelling and holding signs and basically protesting in a council meeting situation. And he was like, stop, this is not on. We will have decorum. You will respect. And he said something to the effect of, I've been here since 1991 and no one's ever done that before. And it was not starting now. Do you understand? You do it now and you're out. And I found that refreshing, because if you can't control yourself, it's why I'm not in politics, because I would not be able to control myself. I would be an irrational woman. But I thought it was very refreshing to hear, just like, listen, this is how it's going to happen here. and far too much respectful discourse is important. It's important. If you disagree, you have to come to the table without being
The
hot, coming in
the
hot.
and we briefly touched on it last week, and I had mentioned it in the January 6th thing, and I brought up, and I got attacked for even possibly referring to the fact that City Council of Vancouver had been invaded, and we were kicked out of our seats, and people were attacking me for saying, well, but my point at that time, it was probably, I was too soon to the table in the conversation. I understand, but I think that my point is the sanctity of the chamber or the legislature or whatever it might be, and the protocols that we have for democracy. Yeah. If you don't have them, you don't have democracy. And so I think we've seen that with January 6th in America. We went, so Malcolm's, the mayor of Richmond, his approach, that is true. And I feel that, I look at Ken Sim with his t-shirts and his, to me, I know that's really cool, man. Like, really, that's really cool. You're like totally rad, dude. But it also speaks to the laziness and laissez-faire-ness of administrating government. I think if you're going in there and you're not doing, first it was the necklaces removed, then it was the this, and then they got this, and they got rid of the picture of the queen, and then so eventually we're like, well, you kind of want to put it, the sanctity, a level of like, okay, this is a chamber. We are respectful here, and we have to have conversations and have proper weigh all the
protocol.
options.
There's protocol
and all that stuff. If you lose that, you lose democracy.
Yeah. I agree with you. And after going, Keith Baldry took me on a tour, his famous tour of the legislature.
Yeah.
And I think I told you, I always imagined what it would feel like to walk through there. I've watched plenty of stuff. I feel like I've been there, but walking through there and having him explain the history and really soaking it up, I felt different about it. When we watch Question Period and the theater of that, I'm like, God, get over yourselves. No, that's part of our process. That's the parliamentary process. And that has gotten us to where we are today, and will sustain what we have today or build on what we have today if we continue to follow protocols and decorum. And, I think it's really important. And we're going to talk a little bit about the United States at some point. I mean, maybe we don't get to it today, but it's pretty obvious there's a lot going on there. But I think really so much changed when the term alternate facts became a thing. Like, when it's one thing to throw down a campaign promise and not deliver on it, that's not unusual. But to actually really come at your opponent with complete and utter knowing it's garbage is unhelpful. And what was happening in Richmond City Hall, bringing it back to Malcolm Brody, is people were yelling stuff that he's like, because there's no time
from
say
the audience.
Yeah, that's not true. Right.
Yeah.
Good note. It wasn't the council people. It was everybody in council was very organized. And then they voted. It was all about opening a safe injection site, a harm reduction site at the Richmond Hospital, which is a Vancouver Coastal Health Hospital, obviously, which the council really has no jurisdiction over. And then promptly Premier David-Eby comes out and says, yeah, we're not doing that because we don't need that in Richmond, because in a year, 25 people typically overdose in Richmond, which is tragic that it's 25 people. But in Vancouver, it's 25 people in 4 days. 4 days.
But although, hey, let's wonder, why is it so many in Vancouver? I think we know why, because we are ghettoizing all of the stuff that you need for drug addiction and mental health care and housing.
Go that way. It's all over there.
So I think spreading that responsibility across the region is something we should think about. And so stopping them doing that in Richmond, to me, is thanks. Here in Vancouver, like and there's argument, oh well, nobody's going to go to Richmond to get their safe injection. I'm like, what, or do their drugs, or what? Well, so okay, but maybe they will. Why does everybody have to come to Vancouver to do all these things? And look what happens. I live in Yaletown. It's not safe on my streets anymore.
Maybe you take some
out of control.
ALR land, is that what it's called? Where there's some like private clubs being run on some of those. How about you take a little bit of that's being misused and turn it into a rehabilitative center and what have you.
Because
and
nobody
put it,
wants to create institutions, Jody. That's institutionalizing. You don't want to do that.
but it's okay to put seniors in care homes.
Yeah, when
You could make it a
they've
care
lost their
home.
minds or they're on
Care
the brink
homes,
and they need
not
help.
institutions, but care homes for
When
people who have
somebody
addiction
needs help,
issues.
when somebody needs
Yeah.
help, we should take care of them.
Oh, we should take care of them.
To
Yeah,
not
harm
take care of
reduction is a
them,
good thing.
to
But
not take
stacking
care
it
of
all
them.
into one neighborhood is not clearly not working.
No.
Right.
And
Something
to
needs
not
to
take care
change.
of people is irresponsible of us as a society. And
I agree with you.
I think with that, this many people dying, and this many people addicted, and this many people on the streets,
It's terrible.
we're all responsible.
Yeah. I feel incredibly helpless. We do what we can. And, you know, yeah, it's terrible. I have friends who have
We know
lost
what the
loved
solutions
ones.
are. The solution is money. It's money and structures, buildings, whether it be homes.
Buildings.
whether it be
Okay, let's go to the
institutions.
Buildex. Let's go to the Buildex.
Buildex.
Breakfast, Buildex. What is this? Nice segue.
Breakfast with my buddies. The three mayors of Burnaby, Surrey, and Vancouver were there in attendance with the
Mike
ICBA's
Hurley.
breakfast. Yep.
Mike Hurley, Brenda Law, Ken Sim, just for people.
Very unusual that would happen because generally egos get in the way in those kinds of things. Usually the Vancouver mayor usually gets special treatment, and certainly with Brenda Locke, she gets a lot of special. She's very, she's in the media all the time right now. So I'm surprised that all three of them agreed to it because it takes away some of their special time in front of a fairly important audience. Not developers at this event. There were some developers there. Mostly it was construction industry or independent construction people or people who supply the building industry. So different kind of audience. So they're not there. So it was interesting because the conversation was about the speed at which there was a lot of conversation, but one, it was, permitting and building and how fast cities are getting things done.
Or
Vancouver, we kind of hear a lot about. Burnaby Mayor Hurley was saying they've got this 6-point checklist, which for like 36 points, I guess the checklist is better than no checklist. And if you don't meet, if you only do 32 of them and you don't finish it, then we can't really do much for you. So I like that kind of idea, but I think it's 36 seems like a lot. And when do they, who knows, how do you know when you haven't done, what's the process? And then Brendan Locke was saying, well, everything's great in Surrey. Everything's wonderful. We're building, we approve things. I'm like, oh, really? Okay. And of course, Ken Sim saying, we're working on it. We're working on it. But if you ask anybody, nothing's changed in the 2 years that they've been there at all speed wise. It still takes forever. And then you hear about places like Kelowna.
Sorry, before you get to Kelowna, did you hear that the study that was done about trying to build just a powder room, a toilet and a sink, and the permitting costs at, I think it was Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Halifax, Montreal, in a number of cities across Canada. And the cheapest was, I think, Halifax. Double check me on this, but numbers wise, I'm going to spitball like $120 in permitting. In Calgary, it was $360 in permitting. In Vancouver, it's $2,100.
Oh my God.
For a powder room, to redecorate a powder, not even to build one, but to just remodel one. $2,100
why are so many people needing powder rooms? But yes, that's crazy. And that sounds about right. In Kelowna, we heard the same thing. It takes 1 week. I think it was 1 week to get a permit in Kelowna, which they have it all digital now. You do it all online. There's a simple process. They actually apparently went to the White House and did a presentation to them to show you how, I was like, what's happening in Kelowna?
Kelowna.
But the one thing that bugged me was all three mayors said how great their staff were, how they were doing all these things. And really, it's the construction and developers who haven't, who aren't filling out the forms properly. And they kind of like, oh man, come on. And then, and so that was one, but one thing
but they're filling them out correctly in Kelowna. It's here that they can't.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Or other places like Chilliwack, which is quite fast, and other places. There are lots of examples. I know, sure, they're smaller, but what's the process? And frankly, this 36-point checklist, if this 36-point checklist works in Burnaby and it's something that's cool, I don't know enough about it. Does Vancouver even know that they have that? Are they talking to each other at a deeper level saying, wow, that works? Let's do that.
Weren't we promised 1 week, 3 weeks, 3 months, what was it?
Yeah, I think it's something like that. 333. The other thing that was interesting, which I thought was they were asked if they thought the developer like that negativity about the people against developers. When I was in council, developers were evil, and I would always say, well, a developer is that's quite a broad term. there's a church group right next to me that built 2 buildings for
Yeah.
people with addictions. It was this Christian, they built 2 buildings. They're developers. Does that
They're
make them
developers.
evil?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So that mood has changed. There's not this antagonism towards developers anymore. That's changed in the last 5 years, which I think is good, because you don't want that kind of slowing things down when you have lots of people who just want to build stuff. We need to build stuff. So that mood they say has changed, and that's real.
Good.
That's helpful.
You've been saying that
if
for
you're a
5 years.
politician.
You've been a champion of that for 5 years. You're like, listen, there are no developments without developers. It's like saying we're going to build everything and you don't have any construction workers. It's fine and dandy to have a plan. And that's one of the big worries, because we've got all the infrastructure that's being built. We got bridges and tunnels and, dams and whatever. And the province is like, we're going to build this many. Well, who's going to build them? Because the skilled workers is a problem. Like, it's just simply not doable at the rate that's being promised. So
yeah, that was a big part of the conversation. There's a lot there too. Yep.
Let's go to, oh my gosh, ArriveCan.
Speaking of bureaucracy, okay, you just lay the groundwork and we'll try to figure out if this was a good thing.
Okay, so it's come to light that it amidst, granted, chaos, right? Once in a generation pandemic, nobody knows really what we're dealing with. Travel is what? How are we going to get people in and out with testing, even to places, panic mode. But it comes to light that the developers of the ArriveCan app are 2 people in a home office who were not just one contract from the federal government, but a number of contracts that added up to $250 million, $250 million in contracts to who? And honestly, George, if I was those 2 people who landed all those contracts from the government in a time where everybody was working from home and nobody really checked, I'd be thrilled. I'd take the work. And
high five to yourself.
What did it cost and what did it deliver? And then there were data breaches, and now do we use it? Don't we use it? I remember trying to help my parents.
Oh my God. I still it's such a complicated process.
It is.
And then you go to the airport and they're saying, what's that? You're like, what?
Yeah. No. You go to show you want to, and they're like,
I know.
No.
Yeah. Do you have a printout? You're like, what? Like, there was just everywhere you'd go, you'd be like, when we started traveling again, it didn't help. It was just very confusing. So there was but we were in a chaotic time. And so, this whole process of, the RFP, request for proposals and all that protocol that, exists in normal times. I mean, I'm sure we'll find a ton of things, all the money that was being given out and so quickly. And now they're going after people now a few years later saying you got overpaid, give us our money back. And people are like, what? I did? Yeah. And which is brutal, but hey, you know what? It's your responsibility as a citizen. You probably knew you got too much.
Even CRA employees knew they were collecting CERB from the inside. There's a lot to police here, because there are people who would absolutely take advantage of the system, and there are other people who wouldn't know better, but it wasn't being monitored the way it should have, because we were in absolute chaos. It should be noted here, when we're talking about money and economies and money being spent and COVID, just announced today that both the economies in Japan and the UK are officially in recession.
Yeah.
So there's two quarters of shrinking economy, right? Equals recession, which means that there might be a trigger in other jurisdictions to bring down interest rates to stimulate the economy again.
My
so it's
mortgage
bad news
comes
with
due
a little
in June, please, soon.
Right.
I hate the concept of, if everybody who knows who locked in a few years ago, now there's renewing. It's like, oh,
yeah, it's painful.
Yeah.
You had a protest in front of your house?
Yeah, this is all we've touched on, this whole Palestinian and this whole Israel thing. But I don't want to get into that. I do want to talk a bit about what I talked about with my son, my youngest kid is 15, who, when you talked earlier about 16. Sorry, his birthday was last week. That's right, 16. Now he wants his driver's license. And you touch on this about, misinformation, that kind of stuff, that fake news or whatever we call it now. And he was showing it he started this thing with Biden, and we said, that's not real. And he's laughing. And he says, yes, it is. Or no, it's not. And then Amanda found the real version of it and did whatever he was showing us. and we were sort of trying to explain to him, and he's getting mad at us, of course, because he's 16 and he's always mad at us.
Right.
About, he's probably listening to this. I'm
Or
sure
rolling
he's a
his
big fan of
eyes.
the show. He's
Is he?
well, when I talk about him, he likes to find out, but he
Oh, I
probably won't
love
want to
that
hear
kid.
this.
At least I knew how
So
old he was. Dad.
dads, we're bad at that. So anyways, but then I was talking, kind of went into this whole, and I lived in Israel, and I remember how tense it was. I lived in the Negev desert. Not, it's not a very small country. So it's very south, close to Eilat. So you're about, you're very close to Egypt, in the middle of the Jordan Valley, and on this moshav that I lived at, it was patrolled with machine guns. It was, it wasn't a kibbutz. It's a moshav. It's a private co-op. They're very rich. They grow vegetables in the middle of the desert, and so I was picking tomatoes. Anyways, it was it was intense to live there. As far as you definitely felt you were in a state of,
High alert.
that anything could
High
happen,
alert.
right? Yeah, high alert.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, but then we're old enough to know, as kids, this is a conversation I was having with him, that I remember the Holocaust being an important part of our conversations as family. My parents, and they are old enough that my mom was in the war, and this is a big deal when we were kids. And the whole Israel thing was an important part of dealing with that, and having a solution for the Jewish people. And what's happened since October is separating where you feel about who's doing what. The fact that there is people that were screaming pretty close on, things that against Jewish people, that were the kinds of things you would have heard in the late 1930s in Germany. And then simultaneously we have Donald Trump, and I'm talking about this with my son, trying to explain, saying that if he's president, he's going to let Russia invade the rest of Europe. This is all getting a little bit too familiar. When we talked earlier about history being a lesson, and learn from it, and don't make the same mistakes, I'm going, oh my God, are we taught? We got hatred towards Jews. We've got a president coming in who's going to say, you know what, we're good here in America. We're not going to help Europe. We're going to pull back. That's what he's saying from NATO.
He said we're going to let Russia do whatever the hell he wants.
Do whatever they want. If they don't pay the bill, Russia can have you.
Yeah.
It's so crazy, and so we're on now, and now we've got these people who are starting to hate Jews. This is crazy. This is crazy. Just like I'm trying to explain this to my son about how important this. Yeah. It's important to be informed, and that things can, and how fast things can change. In 4 short months, we've come to this, and wherever you stand on the issue, it's an intense moment right now in the world, really intense. And then over there in Taiwan, you're thinking, okay, geopolitical, which would be similar to what was happening in Japan, like the fear of Taiwan being invaded by China at the same time. This is just a little too familiar to me, and I'm a little bit worried.
Yeah,
because I thought we were going to have cyber wars, not real wars anymore. Like, what happened to not having guns anymore, and just trying to take over countries through economics and hacking? Right. It's like, that was way better.
And I think, to your point of the conversations we're having with our young people, the conversations we're having with each other, the conversations that are being had over the fence with our neighbors that we might not spend a lot of time with, but we interact with, everybody's got a new level of tension, right? Mm-hmm. That high alert that you talked about from living when you were picking vegetables in the valley in Israel all those years ago, mm-hmm. That high alert feeling is very, very real. And when we feel helpless about what we cannot control what is happening in Gaza, we cannot control what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing, a man that was on his way to jail before this war started. I mean, mm-hmm. There's so many layers here, but that it is impacting all the way here that children going to school, children who happen to be Jewish that are going to school, are now being screamed at by people just simply because this person is from this country and these people attend their religious temple versus, it's such a leap. And I don't know whether it's naivete on my part, but like you said, I'm not weighing in on who's right and who's wrong.
No,
it's that walking down the street here feels incredibly different than it did even 4 months ago, to your point. The escalation of tensions, and everybody's just got to bring it down.
Exactly.
We need to learn from history.
That's our point.
That's our point. So
Yeah.
let's
Take a step back, everybody. Let's just keep things in perspective here, and let's try and find a solution as quickly as possible. I think they are trying to find solutions for this. I know it's not perfect, but we can't have the alternative. We can't go there. This is
what you can
too
do
much.
is stay tuned to Unspun podcast. It drops every Thursday with this cat. His name is George. You can find him on Twitter,
George_Affleck,
George_Affleck on your Twitter. I'm at Jody Vance, Jody with a Y. Follow me, the irrational woman, on Twitter. I'm gonna drop that moniker now. That's the last time I'm gonna call. Self-talk matters, George. I feel good about who I am. And the people that are coming for me on the social media, trust me, you're not taking up a lot of room in my head. And if you come at me hard enough, I will report you to the police. So good luck with that.
Serious
Say goodbye,
business.
George.
Bye. Have a good week. See ya.